Welcome back to the Grio. Did you know that 1 out of 4 transgender and non-binary youth reported a suicide attempt in the previous year? That's according to a recent study by the Trevor Project. The new survey also found that nearly 80% of black and transgender youth have experienced discrimination due to their sexual orientation or gender identity. And 40% reported being physically threatened or harmed. That's double the rate of black cisgender LGBTQ peers. What can be done to help mitigate the negative challenges that they face? Joining me now to help answer that question is Hope Giselle. She is a diversity and inclusion specialist and trans activist. I'm also joined by David Johns. He is the executive director of the National Black Justice Coalition. Is this a public health crisis? I don't want to be hyperbolic. I don't want to exaggerate. But when I look at these numbers, when I look at these stats, Hope Giselle, I see a public health crisis.
It most certainly is. I think that when we talk about the rates in which our black children, especially if we're concerned with the lives and the bodies of black children and children at large, we're seeing a lot more of children say, I would rather give up than continue to fight in a system and a world that's against me. We're looking at the laws that are telling folks that they cannot transition. And now it's not even the space of, I can transition if my parents support me. Now, even if you have the support of your parents, there's no way that you can go into a space, have that conversation, have those conversations with doctors, because now your doctors will be threatened to lose their license. Those doctors won't be able to practice. Your parents will, your parents can be incarcerated in some states. And this is ridiculous. I think that when we really think about the health and safety of children, we have to think about what's going to be the best for that child. And I think that oftentimes their parents and healthcare physicians know best.
David, when I hear about people shot in Chicago, or I think about even the PTSD people get from having and knowing people shot in Chicago, when I think about queer youth who are committing suicide at high rates or who are harmed, bullied, kicked out of their homes at a high rate, all these things to me are public health crises. And this issue around trans communities also seems like another one. And in all those examples, it seems like when it's black folk, when it's brown folk, when it's vulnerable folk, we don't use the word public health crisis. But let some white folk in Appalachia get hooked on some opioids and suddenly the news flash, the ticker saying public health crisis. Help me make sense of why that happens and if there's anything we can do to let people really appreciate how much of a crisis this is.
Yeah, I appreciate the question and the foundation that my good sister Hope laid. We know that there's a hesitancy to name something a public policy problem because once it is identified as a problem, people expect solutions. They expect to see meaningful and measurable shifts in response to that problem. What we know is that our babies, Black youth generally, have been ringing this mental health alarm for quite some time, Mark. This unnerves me as an educator, a former kindergarten, third grade teacher, because I've never met a child who asked to be born. Yet the suicide rates for Black youth have doubled over the last 2 decades, which is alarming because, again, kids don't ask to be born, but those same rates are decreasing for every other community of children. This report from the Trevor Project is incredibly important because too often we don't collect data about students in educational settings that allow them to talk about their sexual identity, gender orientation, or expression. And when we do collect data based on sexual identity, gender orientation, or expression, it's often restricted to risk connected to behavior. Think HIV or other things connected to the CDC. And so what we should all be clear about is that all of our babies, Black babies, are ringing the alarm, and Black trans, queer, and non-binary and non-conforming babies are our babies too. The data shows that 1 in 4 have contemplated suicide in the last year. We should know that that is underreporting, in part because the data was collected online. Black people who identify as LGBTQIA+ are concentrated with other Black people. We live in the South. We are disproportionately represented in small, rural, and isolated communities that experience digital deserts. And so we should all be on high alert that our babies are ringing the alarm, and there are elected and appointed leaders who are abdicating responsibility because they don't want our babies to be well. To go back to the segment you had previously, Michael knows is no fool, and the word for what they're doing is gaslighting, talking about not wanting trans and non-binary and non-gender conforming folks to not have access to gender affirming care, to not be able to play sports, to not be able to go to the bathroom. All of that is tantamount to suggesting that they should not exist in public. And we know based on this kind of data that these messages are also communicated to them that they shouldn't exist in private. So anybody who loves Black people should be alarmed and be showing up to support the mental health and well-being of all of our babies, especially trans and non-binary folks, especially trans girls.
That's such an important point you add, David, and Hope, when we think about what support looks like, we talked about public support, we're talking about political will and commitment at the policy level. What about families? What can families do, and what role are families currently playing? Are trans and non-binary youth generally getting support from families?
In our households, absolutely not. And I think that we know why. We grew up in spaces, most of us grew up in spaces where we were raised Baptist, we were raised Christian. It was go to church or you do nothing. It was leave from church on Sunday, go to church on Wednesday, Bible study on Saturday. There were all of these different things. And all of that stuff helps to inform the ways in which we think about what it means to be good and what it means to be right as a Black person. When we think about the ideas of what it means to be queer while being Black, we already know that there's a stigma against that. So think about what it means to be transgender. What does it mean to ascend the gender and then go against God completely, right? And literally tell God that you don't agree with something that, this God did, and that's whether or not you agree with the God that was, bestowed upon you at birth or not. The problem that I think is that in Black communities and in a large part of the communities is that we're not trying to raise kids to be their own selves. We're trying to raise little versions of ourselves. We want kids to embody all of the things that we couldn't. So if I couldn't become the basketball star, you're going to do it because that was my dream. If I couldn't become the ballerina, you're going to do it because that was my dream. If I never made it out of the hood, if I never made it out of these messed up situations, you're going to. And the sad part about it is that as Black folk, we have to recognize and realize that our children are not our second chance to get it right. You don't get to tell your child that they're not transgender because you wanted a second chance at being a better man or a better woman. You don't get to tell them that they don't get to be who they are and get to love the way that they want to because you need grandchildren to suffice your fact that you didn't think that you did the best job with your own. This is not your do-over. And a large part of the reason why we're seeing issues with folks not getting support that they need in the home is because there are far too many folks trying to get their second chance to their children. And when they realize that those children have plans for themselves and that those children have thoughts and that they're actual people and not just little mini-me's, we often see those people be disproportionately thrown out of homes and into homelessness, which is a whole other conversation.
So then, David, what can we do? I mean, we see lawmakers out here. Some have introduced bills to protect various communities, but I don't know if the bills are passing, and I don't know if there's a real kind of political will to make it happen.
So yes, let me build a bridge between what the good Sister Hope said and where you are, which is to acknowledge that there were more than 300 pieces of anti-truth, anti-Black, don't say gay, don't say Black legislation introduced across 42 states throughout this country. It is nearly impossible to go to a place where these bills have not either been introduced or codified. Very much connected to that, politicians are using an old tactic to drive wedges between our community, playing on scarcity mindset and fear. Up under so much of what Faith talked about and what exists in church hurt in our communities is people not having access to information and to intimate relationships with people who can help them answer questions and address the ignorance that they have. What we know is that the solution to the challenges around suicidality, mental health, and depression amongst our baby is being supported in community. The data shows that 46% of the babies surveyed showed that having the support of a loving, supportive family made the difference in them contemplating or considering or attempting suicide.
It's some of this stuff, and I hate to interrupt you, my brother. We're out of time. Hope, David, thank you so much for joining me. Everybody stay right here, and if you or someone you know is struggling with suicidal thoughts or mental health issues, please call or text 988. Next on the Grio with Marc Lamont Hill, from Howard University swim team to the Creed 3's opening weekend, we're going to break down some of the top sports highlights of the weekend. Plus, a new streaming site dedicated to creators of color is up ahead.